Hello everyone, welcome. It's been a while since we've talked about said subject of collecting, of buying, and saving money while buying games. Now, there's a reason that it took me a really long time to kind of continue this subject with saving money and collecting and that. And that's kind of because over the years, a lot of things have changed. Like, I don't buy a crap load of stuff online. Usually, when it comes to harder to find things like TurboGrafx or importing and such, I would usually buy online. But I don't. I'd say most of what you see has I'd say maybe like at most 25% of what I own came from online. And most of the rest I've gotten in person from a store in some fashion. But I mean, I did get a fair shake of things off of online too, so not completely down like that. But really, the online has a lot of interesting things, and I know there's different people like I don't really watch the Game Chasers. I do watch Pat NES Punk sometimes once in a while when I don't really have much to watch, and I know Pat in specifically loves to talk a lot about issues with collecting online and such, and I think that kind of goes into our subject of trying to save money. Willie, something Pat will always talk about is an NES collection. He has a complete NES collection, and the NES for the last several years has gone through this really weird age where a lot of crap's being hoarded and price gouged online and shit. And right now, really, the NES is really like not insane, but I mean, if it's a Nintendo original property, it's going to demand money. If it had low print copies, it's going to demand a lot of money. And then, of course, if it happens to be a really good game with a really low print one, it's going to demand a lot of money. Like, something I really always wanted was a copy of Little Samson. I've always thought that was a really interesting game. That is probably one of the few really expensive NES games I'm interested in. Because usually most really expensive NES games or stuff like Action 52, they were just awful, but they had such a limited one that they're insanely collectible. It's so bizarre. I've always talked about occasionally I sometimes get someone asking about my collection and stuff. Like, I've had somebody ask me, am I a person trying to, get a complete set of something in that? And no, I like collecting games I like. The only time I'll basically ever really go after a bad game is if it happens to be connected to a series I like. If that ain't the only reason I ever got Resident Evil Gaiden and Gun Survival 2, I believe, which was if that's the wrong number, it's the one that's only been in Japan. It was on the PS2, and it was like some alternate dimension Code Veronica weird shit where you were Clara. It was weird. But, yeah, I mean, that's usually the only excuse I'll ever really welcome really bad games into my game collection usually. I mean, sometimes I take a risk and I get an oddball game I never heard of or something, and I take a chance to see if it's any good, and sometimes it ends up not being, and that happens sadly when you take a roll with the dice and you have a lot of times, like on my phone, I'll usually look up video game play, but sometimes you might not have a signal or something, so you don't always have a way to really check what kind of game it is. It's just kind of basing off the cover, sadly. But basically, if you're looking to save money and you're in a collected, you're into basically trying to collect a lot, the NES is basically in a bad. It's a bad time to collect for the NES right now, really. If you're looking to do mass collections, stuff like Sega consoles, the Sega Genesis primarily actually has some fairly decent prices for all its games, really, with only a few occasional that spike past 100. I don't know of a crap load of games that are really expensive on the Genesis right now, but really the whole kind of collection thing and that kind of just goes with time and that, I really feel like it has a lot to do with somebody wanting to reconnect with their past. So I think like as time goes, the hell, I actually kind of think if it wasn't for the digital revolution of re-releasing games, I think the PS1 era would be kind of going through that now. But because a lot of the PS1 games have been re-released in that, I think that's like counteracted some stuff. I mean, like, I remember in the early ages of the internet, for me, I mean, I'm not talking about the ages for like the Spoonie one where you had like fucking DOS interface. I don't have that much related to DOS. A little, with Apple IIs, but that's from school. But, like around Windows 98 kind of time period of that. I know I was a big person looking up stuff on Amazon to look for stuff, and I know when I was looking for certain games I didn't know of. I mean, I liked Squaresoft, but obviously, due to not having a lot of information, I didn't know all the kind of, games they've done. And, Chrono Trigger used to demand shitloads of money, but now you can get on the PS1, the DS, you can get digital versions of it. That stuff has brought a lot of these really expensive games down. I mean, Super Mario RPG used to be a really, really expensive game, and that's went down. And a lot of people are hoping that over the next few years that Earthbound will start meeting there, because now you can get for like $7 on the Wii U. So once the Wii U starts picking it up and getting into a lot more homes, and I mean like $7, for awesome game experience and for a game that's really hard to get for under $200. I mean, I had to pay like $80 for my copy of Earthbound. I mean, even that's a freaking lot. I mean, it's vastly cheaper than what you can usually get it for, but that's still a freaking lot. And I had connections to a former employee to Game Exchange before a whole bunch of controversy shit that happened with him. Probably the only really sweet deal I ever got from him, to be honest, though I did get a few other interesting things from him. But, really, it just... The game market with the digital age is really affecting prices of certain games. But then you got stuff like Little Samson and that doesn't really have any domain of anyone really knowing if they clearly own it or anything. Going out to re-release this stuff, so you still have all this stuff lost in the void. In DOS games, there's crap loads of DOS games lost way long ago in the ages and that, and it's tricky in that. But retro gaming overall doesn't have all the worst things when it comes to prices, to be honest. But I think something specifically, out of all the videos I ever really listened to Pat talk about collecting and scapers and shit on like eBay and stuff, I always feel like he never really considers us, the niche people into Japanese RPGs and that so much. I mean, like, for example, I'd say like War Rose is, in my opinion, one of the more rarer titles on a PS2, and PS2 ain't that incredibly long ago compared to an NES and that, I mean, they're all rare games on some of the systems. And, well, I know rare is subjective based on, I mean, for example, like Earthbound ain't technically a rare game. It's more like a game that tons of people want to own. and it's more like, it's more like a supply and demand kind of thing in that. And Wool Woes was an actual issue of the amount of copies they made. They did not make a lot of copies. As far as I understand, it only had one print one. It never got a second print one or anything. So it had a low amount of copies. And that price tag you saw on there, when I showed this after visiting my sister and her husband, I was so shocked to see this complete with its book and its game and everything in good condition for $60 basically. And I mean, considering I don't think I've ever seen it really go below 150. I mean, $60 is a fair price in my opinion, though. At least that's not going into outrageous amounts. At least that's just going for what a new game usually goes for. So, but anyway, I've always blabbed a lot about collecting and crap and that, and it's really time to start talking about how to save some money. Saving money in the game industry is not usually a simple thing. I mean, especially if you like collector's editions, because stuff like a lot of collector's editions usually, just to get that out of the way, usually, get sold out and then they become usually really expensive. I mean, for example, I looked up Echo of the August War 1. Which in America, the only physical version is for the 360. Now, the game itself, pretty cheap, pretty dirt cheap, but that collector's edition, all the way past $100 for that damn thing. So, it always has a commanding price, and I don't know what Catherine stands at. I bet it's a decent chunk. Collector's editions just automatically get resold for way more than they were originally usually. A lot of the niche ones usually. Stuff like the Arkham Collector's editions and shit, and the Duke Nukem, that shit goes way... A lot of the niche limited editions become costly. So if you're really interested in those, you don't really have a big choice but to get those early. But always keep in mind, that doesn't always happen. Like Final Fantasy 13-2, I got for probably 30% off. I mean, that ain't always the case, so always keep that in mind. But of course, usually the more common method, and I don't encourage this when it's a game you either like, interest, or company, or franchise you like, because I consider it unsupportive. But, you gotta pick and choose what games you want to support and what games you think. How I do it personally, and this is just my perspective. This is my perspective. I want to support good games. And of course, at times, that's taking a risk on whether you think that game is going to turn out good or not if you pre-order that. But I like to support good games, good publishers, or niche releases and stuff. So I tend to buy those more brand new and usually as soon as possible, while shit like GTA or Halo, that's going to sell millions already and shit, I don't worry about. Because for one thing, I already know they're going to most likely sell really well. So the publisher on that is always going to get compensated. I mean, GTA 5 was the best-selling game ever now. So, until whatever the next big hit. And then the second reason is secondhand use. I mean, there are a lot of Western games that are really popular like that. I don't usually get brand new too often. Sometimes I do. Like, I got GTA 4 new, and that was because I was more interested in the story, because I really actually like Nico Bellic. But anyway, a lot of Western games, usually they have the tendency of ending up in dump bins. This kind of goes why I wanted to talk about Willie mainly in this video. And I know this has been a long video, it's probably so far away. Yeah, it's always 14 minutes, so I apologize for that. But mainly, we deal with a lot of niche games, and I'm sure I don't really need to tell you that a lot of our games end up either being worthless or very expensive in a span of time. And sometimes it's really hard to know that. But a lot of Western games don't usually end up in that, like stuff like Halo and that. Like every Halo game, OSTD is the only one I ever bought new, and believe me, I was like Angry Joe when I fucking beat that. Oh, man. I think I almost was going to get sick, though. But every other Halo game, I've always got used for, like, $5. Because the audience doesn't collect the games, really. They don't like keeping them. They don't like displaying them like trophies for the most case. A lot of the core audience for those games usually dump them. And over time, it oversaturates the market. And thus, they, like GameStop and shit, end up with too many copies and, have to start marking them down to get the fuck out of the store and that, So, that's usually never really a huge priority for me to go and shell out for too often. So, that's why usually I get a lot of the niche RPGs now. And stuff like, say, like Diablo 3 and things, I don't always... Of course, Diablo 3 I would have actually gone on day one, because I actually do like the Diablo series, if it wasn't for the fucking retarded DRM system, but, that's a whole other story. I guess that was a bad example, but... Really, it's really hard to judge. With new games, like, we're getting... This year we only got a handful of Vita games, and we got more coming, and it's really hard to tell, which ones are going to become valuable and which ones are going to fall apart. And you can't always base it on whether they're good or not. I mean, obviously collecting, if you're concerned about value or whether it'll spike up, it being good does not always be a sign. I mean, look at Action 52. That's possibly one of the worst fucking games ever fucking made. 52 short, horrifying, crappy Atari-like games jammed into an NES cartridge. That's one of the most valuable NES games. So, the type of enjoyment doesn't always factor in. I mean, how many copies, interest, known for it and stuff. And sadly, like, a lot of these stories recently about, like, people saying they've sold this or that, like that, the World Champions cartridge that got sold several months back and that, stuff like that drums up this stuff. Because, sadly, there are assholes out there, and that's what I talked about in the first video, that there are assholes out there who just don't give a shit about what we do or what we like or anything. They just want profit, profit, profit. These things mean nothing to them in any form of fun, emotion, or story-driven experience at all. It's just cash, cash, cash. And they only invest to sell back for even higher. And sadly, they're just going to go with what's considered cool. And when it comes to the whole retro thing, the NES is big right now. They're like all those clones and stuff over the last several, 5 years, have made the whole retro market with the NES just boom. Tons of mom and pop stores have been wanting to get NES games to the buttloads. And then, Super Nintendo and getting Genesis and that. To a certain extent. So, to my experience, a lot of mom and pop stores are dropping Genesis games a lot. And it's really hard to get a good deal, obviously, with games that, depending on which particular system, generation, and what kind of niche. I mean, Japanese niched RPGs in America usually end up becoming expensive because of either limitations on how many copies were sold. Because we keep our games usually. There are those who get rid of their games in every genre, every type of that. But RPG niche Japanese people, Japanese titled games and that, usually tend to keep their games more. They feel more connected to their games. So that has a, lesser pull in the field out there versus the 5 million copies of Halo 1 and 2 you can find. You know, before like GameStop and shit dropped all that stuff. So, uh, now online, personally, in my opinion, in this day and age, online is really difficult to get a good deal. You can find good deals, especially when stores do special deals. But when you're buying secondhand, like on Amazon, eBay, Craigslist, it's sadly really hard to get a good deal. Craigslist used to be good. Craigslist is pretty shitty now. It basically ended up like eBay, where it just has a lot of people price gouging like hell. I used to be a big supporter of Amazon, but Amazon's really experienced. I don't think it's as bad, but it has a lot of the when it comes to sealed or new copies that or in mint condition shit, a lot of that has drizzled into Amazon over the years as well. Used wise isn't as bad on Amazon in my opinion, but of course that also varies from game to game too. I mean, they're all still like Earthbound, still demands a high price no matter where the hell you look. So, but when it comes to online stores, you're usually not going to find a good deal. Most places are going to want a good price. I mean, really, when you go to yard sales, any kind of swap meets, and personally, I've only been to one swap meet, and where I live isn't really probably a good place to really do swap meets. I know Pat in East Punk has done shitloads of swap meets. I kind of wish I could go to one of those awesome kind of swap meets personally, but if you're in a location that has good swap meets or any swap meets, it might be worth trying to see gauge how good it might be. It might be worth your time to go once in a while if it does turn out decent. Because really, anything that involves person-to-person interaction is usually going to be a better experience. And no, GameStop is usually not a good place to get good deals unless they're doing like a buy two, get one free is about the only way to usually get a good deal. You sometimes can find good deals at GameStop, but not too freaking often, to be honest. I mean, I usually will find shit cheaper online than GameStop. So, aside from GameStop, mom and pop stores, pawn stores, yard sales, flea markets are usually going to be better ways to get deals or at least have some haggling. Now, I do recommend being careful if you haggle. I have attempted to haggle before, and it always... Pawn shops, I don't really recommend haggling unless you know the people are nice or interested in doing that. A lot of times, I mean, pawn shops, in my opinion, are the lesser of all the recommendations because, you know, they want to make up a certain amount of money back from what they bought from someone else. And depending on, you know, whether they're well researched and checking out the value of what they're getting, or they're just like, here's some money and that. Because, I mean, the pawn shop that when I first moved up here, I got a few things from it for very good prices. I got a PS1 version of Lunar Silver Star, which I only owned the Sega CD version, so that was just amazing. And then I also got my box copy with a book and everything of Illusion of Gaia for $5. At least I think it was either $5 or $15. Either way, it was nowhere over like $20, and it was just like, oh my goodness. I also got this one, and I'm pretty sure it's not very expensive, but it's a box copy, so that's still pretty nice. That. But now they over the time that I've lived up here, more closer to work, ever since I left my parents, that pawn shop's been more self-aware of the kind of games it's selling a lot more. And, like, I remember this one time, there were two Super NES games I was interested in. And I had looked them up on my phone on their value, and to be quite honest, they were selling them for like $15, and they were like $4 on like Amazon. So I offered them like $7, and then when I said that, like mid-sentence, the guy's like, no, It's like, and it just varies on the staff really in that, some people are willing to go low on that. It really depends on the amount of greed and how willing they are to part with the item, which is usually why yard sales are usually a better place. Because yard sales, people are actually trying to get rid of stuff or make money. They're not usually in a position to be like, well, on eBay, that's $40. And let me tell you, anyone who starts comparing prices, if you're talking to any pawn shop or anyone, and they're like, well, on eBay or well, on Amazon, then you might as well really walk away unless there's a really good deal or game you want from them and you want to try and haggle with them. Because to be honest, in the most case, unless they have something really interesting, it's probably not worth it for some kind of common game. Because they'll gouge it. That's a kind of a gouging personality, It's just like, yeah, I'm not even dropping 25 cents off. It's like, I mean, if the game's always cheap, haggling it's pretty stupid. But, if they're asking for like $50 for something you're pretty well sure of ain't even worth that much, they're just trying to fucking get money out of people. And I gotta tell you, especially if I've gotten a number of used PC games, and you have to be careful when you buy used PC games, because as you of course probably know, more modern games are connected with Steam or have product codes and stuff. And older ones, like Diablo and Diablo 2, those codes are ones you can use again. They just verify the disc is legitimate and stuff. But, the ones that require online activation and stuff, you gotta be careful when you mess with used PC stuff. When I went to the flea market I could tell you the most common game, and I'm pretty sure this is probably pretty common at flea markets. Because, you have people who don't know a crap load about this. You have moms and dads probably selling their kids games and shit off. But probably the most common games I saw at that freaking flea market was MMOs. PC MMOs, and unless it's a free MMO, the odds are it had an activation code, and the odds are that's used, because why the fuck would they buy it and not use it then? So, obviously that's always very bad to even invest in, obviously. But you want to be careful and be aware of what time periods of DRM existed. Because, in the older days, you also got to keep in mind there were DRM with that too. Let's see, which one? I think Leisure Suit Larry had one of the DRM methods. And you want to be aware of what kind of DRM. I believe with Leisure Suit Larry, in the back you get phone numbers that you use to confirm that you have a legitimate copy, and then one of these also contained one of those things that allow you to decode information. I can't remember which one it was. Really don't want to dig through all of them, to be honest, but I had one that had they look kind of like 3D glasses with the red stuff for that, but what it's for is for decoding basically a message that comes with it. So if you're going to deal with used PC games, be aware of what time period and DRM may be effective. Old DRM codes and stuff you can acquire online, so that's not usually a problem, but obviously games of now are different, especially if they're connected to Steam and stuff and that. So, really, when it comes to the retro scene, though, basically anything that isn't Nintendo, the NES and Super Nintendo, in my opinion, are going through a correction issue right now. I feel like the Super Nintendo's kind of clearing up because of the digital age. The NES, not so much, because there's a lot of titles. Like, look at DuckTales. I mean, if it wasn't for the whole deal with Disney, Capcom, and Way Forward and shit with DuckTales Remastered, that game would never saw a re-release, you know. It's lost and trademarked. I mean, Capcom owns the game, but, you know, all the characters and property and that's owned by Disney, and, you know, that's a whole freaking thing of lost games that have to have multiple parties. I mean, that's why it took so long for, like, Crash Bandicoot and, like, Super Mario RPG to appear in digital stores, because they involved in multiple parties, and until they agreed, it would just stay in limbo land. There's way too many games on the NES, in my opinion, that fit that criteria versus the Super Nintendo. There was a lot more games that were lost in ownership and or being able to be released without having tons of renegotiated contracts and stuff. And I feel like that's why the NES continues to have a lot of rarity, but the Super Nintendo's dying down more because there was a lot less of that property. Those properties still exist, of course, but I feel like there's a lot less than that. But Genesis and stuff has a lot of available games you can get for much more cheaper than that. And, you know, generally, you know, I've really sidetracked a lot when I think about this. But originally, I was going to say, you know, what I was talking about with niche games and Western games and that, you know, a lot of people, you know, generally skip out on a release and wait for the price to drop. That is a very common practice. And, you know, a lot of people don't have tons of money to shell out. You know, I'm single. I rent a place. I own my car, so I no longer pay on a car bill. So I just pay my rent, my electric, water, and occasional propane for the oven and the water tank heater. And that's really all I pay. Well, there's my car insurance too, but that's not as bad either. So I have a lot less bills too. I'm single, like I said, and I work a factory job, which means I generally get paid decently. It's shitty ass work, but I get paid pretty decently. So I have a lot of expendable income at the end of the day, basically. So, you know, to me, buying some new games usually ain't generally a hardship. But, you know, you got people who have families, kids and shit, and they can't do that as easily. And that's why I think it's more important for them to try to support games they really want to encourage buying brand new and ones they, you know, that are going to be financially fine. You know, don't worry about getting those day one. Let those ones drop down. Those will be fine. But, you know, that's my philosophy, like I said. Not trying to push that on anyone. That's just my personal philosophy in trying to help those who need the money more. But, of course, you know, that's going to obviously be geared towards the kind of games you are, too. So. But, you know, really, in our niche audience and that, we're going to always, as long as the physical media of the game still exists, our audience in the niche Japanese RPGs or indie RPGs and stuff, as long as the physical media of them still, we're going to always really experience these parts. Well, I mean, look, all the RPGs on, like, the Dreamcast and Sega Saturn, like the whole Panzer Dragoon RPGs and shit, or the Shining Force RPG on the, like, those are expensive. Like, it's usually RPGs and Japanese games, a lot of times, they're really expensive. And you might think, how do I get around that? How can I save some money? But I want to experience these really good games. And what I personally did is, as you probably know still, that is a Japanese version of that. And, you know, of course, that is not something everyone's willing to do. Because obviously, you know, you're sacrificing the English translation and such, and, you know, if you don't know Japanese, you have a lot more figuring out to do. But if you really want to try a game, and you don't want to shell out like $299 for Earthbound, but you want a physical version of it to at least justify the legalization of owning it. Because personally, while I will admit when I was young, I'm just trying to look for a game down here on my shelf. When I was young, probably like anyone who was young who's discovered emulation, you just like, holy shit, I could get crap loads of games off the internet for free and that. And, as I grew up, I obviously wanted to respect the medium more, so I will encourage getting a physical version of something to, if you're going to emulate a game, and this is the Search for Eden, the Japanese version, that vastly cheaper. A lot of Japanese versions of games are vastly cheaper than their American counterparts, because in Japan it's kind of a reverse thing. These RPGs for the most case are the Halos and such in Japan, so they're oversaturated there. So usually in the end, there's always a crap load of them. But they're all games. The Real Ghostbusters 2, which was made by HAL Laboratory, which never came to America, and Mr. Gimmick are two fine examples of Japanese games that are insanely fucking rare. And that's pretty rare in my opinion, because a lot of Japanese games, they're all rare Japanese games, of course, but in my experience, a lot of times you can vastly find all the prices compared to pound Europe versus Japan's price so dramatically low in Japan. So when it comes to doing that, and if it's not RPG, something that doesn't really need the English language, like if it's some kind of puzzle game or something that doesn't really require knowing a lot of the text or that, or a platform or something, that's usually not that big effective towards whether it's an import or not. But, I usually deal with a lot of RPGs, so, that's a more tricky subject when it comes to this. But that's one way to save money, is to consider import of a whale version of a game. But really having good contacts of some sort is, of course, another good tip. Over the years, I've had good contacts with different store clerks that have came and gone really, aside from GameStop, ask these people if, if somebody comes in with TurboGrafx games or something, would you give me a call or give them my number or, take them in for something and I'll compensate, work a deal out with some of these stores. If you're a common customer, you're shown to be trustworthy and very interested, some of these people may really be willing to help you find games you want. Because you'd be surprised what kind of stuff walks in the stores. It could be helpful to even ask your GameStop, possibly, if you have good connections with them. I've debated about doing that personally, because a lot of people sometimes do carry retro shit into a GameStop not realizing they'll accept it. But I don't know if the manager would really, I would feel that would probably be against the rules or something at GameStop. But I have thought about asking her that before. But with a lot of mom and pop stores, pawn shops, if you show a lot of interest, you're a common customer and you're trustworthy, some of these people might be worth, helping you, giving you a number out to, if they're not interested, they might be willing to give them your number and be like, well, I know a kid who's interested in these kind of games, give him a call, he might, throw you some money for this stuff or something, But of course, again, that depends on a lot of the workers and that. Now, I personally just like getting games. I do like getting them complete with a case and book and stuff, but I really just like getting games. And the only times I usually dwell a lot on cases is with a lot of our handhelds and stuff that just has small little fucking game carts these days that are so easy to freaking lose and shit. But, I have tons of cartridges, I have 3 huge stack NES games. I have a decent amount of Super Nintendo. Really, I don't have a shitload of Genesis games. There were games I like on the Genesis, but it's never been a big thing with me. But I have a decent handful of Sega Genesis games and stuff. I mean, I got a good chunk of games, and usually, generally, I'm not some big freak about getting it complete. I would prefer it to, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to kill me, I want to enjoy the product. I'm not one of those people that like siliconing my games into plastic to preserve them forever. Like, that's just so counterproductive to enjoying the game, you know? Know what I mean? Yeah. Now, that's just some of the trouble with really getting, especially older games. Getting newer games obviously depends on a lot of different. But going back to older games, depending on what kind of system you want, your what system you're trying to get games for. The NES and Super NES seem kind of right now, especially the NES, like I said. But the Genesis seems pretty good. TurboGrafx games are starting to been going up these days, and Neo Geo just never fucking goes down. It never seems to ever go down. Now, whale games. You're always going to have those games that are just hard to get no matter what country or that you're trying to get from, or some like Mr. Gimmick or the Real Ghostbusters 2 from the HAL Laboratory. Really, it's just a game of keeping an eye open, searching, and looking for a good deal. Good connections can help. You can say, I'm looking for this and that. Having some open eyes and that. Now, game trading has become more and more bigger over the years with YouTube and forums and that. And I've never done game trading online before. And I personally don't recommend it unless you trust the person. Because you're always going to be throwing in that risk of, swapping your item in the mail and, you're not doing any form of real legal paperwork here, so it's not like you can go to the cops and be like, this guy didn't, because on Amazon, eBay, that they are legally bound to do something and shit. But if you just do a trade over the internet, you're taking the risk they might just fucking gank you, And I've heard people do that before and that, so that's just, I don't really consider that very trustworthy. But if you have trustworthy sources or such, it's an option to keep open, but always keep in mind you're taking a risk on it. Now, I don't know what the general age of a lot of my viewers are. I know there's young and old people, and like some people's audiences sometimes have a lot of young people, older people, and that. And for more like people my age, you're all the way in actual society with a job and stuff. Some little just basic tip things that I do to try to save a little money. And be aware, you could argue some of this is just being a penny pinching saver, but every time I go to Comic-Con, I open up my bank of all the change and stuff I save and put in it. I usually end up with about $150 to $200 to help me out when I go to New York and shit. So you know what? It helps me out. So anyway, gas obviously is something you have to buy if you have a car and you drive to work or you drive to places. And gas, keeps going up and occasionally goes down by low. What I usually do is, a lot of people don't realize the lower your gas gets, the more quickly it vaporizes. Gasoline vaporizes really fast with contact with air. And what happens is the more room there is in your gas tank and air gets in there, it's causing evaporation with the gas faster. So it's actually a good idea to keep your tank full and topped off. But at the same time, what I do is I try to look for when the price goes down some. I usually don't let my tank go below halfway. and I try to look for opportunity, gauge whether they're going to go up and down. You know, if the holiday or something's coming up, usually prices get jacked up. You know, Christmas, Labor Day and stuff, holidays where people would normally go on trips and stuff, gas will get jacked up. So when there's a dip in the gas going down, I'll usually fill up. And then, you know, I'll wait for the next time it seems like it went down decently and fell up again there. But usually if I'm getting close to halfway, I'll just kind of gauge a little sooner of a good price. And, you could be arguing that's some pennies and nickel or something here and there or that. But, like I said, you throw your change in the bank, it can add up in that. And something that also helps, this depends on your kind of gas stations, but there are gas stations that sometimes have reward cards or they offer little deals. There's a gas station in this town where I live that actually will, every gallon will charge 2 cents less if you pay in cash. Because obviously, when you use a debit card and stuff or a credit card, the company has to deal with a transaction fee, and that's why some places sometimes demand actual more money. Not a lot of places, but some places demand. Like when I first started with the rental service, when I lived on Dilworth, when I went to try and pay with a debit card, they said it costed $20 additional fucking dollars. Like, that's stupid as fuck. But they do go through a little transaction thing. So it's an encouragement for people to not pay with a card and pay in cash. But you see, you make out little. So if I wait for the gas to go down a little and then the 2 cents off, I save a little here and there on gas. And another tip about the vapor, your gas vaporing because of the air, it can also be caused from its flow into your gas tank. If you're the type of person that pulls the handle all the way up and lets it go full blast, you're technically actually losing gas. The splashing effect causes also the vapor to happen. So if you actually do it more midway pull and let it stream in slower, you don't cause that effect as much. And the last tip I really have to offer there is to never ever, and this is a tip I got, a tip I learned per se, through safety tips and stuff. So this is not only good for your car, but it's also good for saving money. If the gas station ever is getting their gas refilled, don't go there. Don't. Because when they're refilling it, the debris in their tank holder, the debris gets mixed up and it starts rising. And that debris can come out through your gas into your car. So that's usually not a good idea. And then it swooshing around can also, in theory, cause you to be getting less gas. Oh, and I do have one other tip. Get gas when it's cold. Now you might ask, what's that matter? Well, gasoline condenses when it's cold and expands when it's hot. So actually you can get more gas from a gas station when it's colder because you're getting more faster because it's not as expanded. It condensed. So you can get more gas from a gas station. So getting it when it's cold is usually a better time to fill up that way too. So looking for the price, getting it when it's coolish instead of really hot, because when it's hot, like I said, it expands, so your car will fill up faster but with less gas. And these are some tips with gas. Now, some general oil tips, just little things. Like I said, this is probably going to sound like a cheapskate thing, but I get a lot of napkins. I mean, not like a lot, like, bleh, but if I ever go to a restaurant like McDonald's or something and I'm eating in or that, I get maybe about that many napkins or something, and I keep them in a little box thing. Now, why do I take napkins now? Well, for one thing, you paid for a service and such, so I think you deserve a few napkins, yeah? But the reason I actually collect napkins is because I use them for tissue or just basic cleaning and such, or if I need to wipe up a mess or something, instead of buying paper towels and such, or buying Kleenexes and that. Now, of course, if you like really soft Kleenexes and that, then, this isn't going to probably be for you. But again, you don't have to really worry about buying paper towels or Kleenexes, and that's one way I save a little extra money when it comes to that. I don't gouge in shitloads of little napkins and that. I take just a little fair, a little teeny bit. And like I said, some people might consider that really penny pinching and that, and you paid for service of food and that. I think you deserve a few napkins. Now, if I was like taking like that many or this many or something, yeah, then that's getting a little ridiculous. Technically, you could also take a little salt and pepper this way if you want, but salt and pepper is really cheap in my opinion, really not worth the trouble. But that's an option too. Sometimes I do get a little Parmesan. I might take 5 packets of Parmesan sometimes for a little Parmesan inside, but I don't generally worry about that. But technically you could do that too. I do usually save ketchup and barbecue packets I get from places too. Again, usually not really a big deal, but barbecue sauce you can save a little bit if you get a few extra barbecue sauces. Ketchup, not generally a big deal, but like I said, I usually just get a few extra napkins. I don't usually worry too much about that, but technically, if you want to go that far, you could, but that stuff's pretty cheap, and I don't usually eat lots of ketchup and salt and stuff, so generally, just one thing. I usually go through a lot of tissue and stuff, so that generally is more of a money consumption thing, so I guess it kind of tends on how often you use something like that. But generally, those are just a few little things you could do there. But the gasoline thing, I think, is a more useful tip as an adult. Obviously, if you have no real income or anything, you probably don't drive or anything, and you don't have responsibilities like that. So generally, that's just a bunch of stuff, I guess. This is probably a really long video too, actually. Yeah, shit, 51 minutes. Wow. I talked a little too long. Well, I apologize for the length, but if you did watch to the end of this point, I hope you learned something, maybe just a little advice or something from someone who's just been getting games a lot. Now, obviously, I am, of course, talking about physical games, not digital games. You got Steam and sales on GOG and stuff for that crap. But, that's all I can really think about at the moment. That if you have any tips, suggestions, or recommendations on saving money or getting games for a decent price, feel free to leave a comment down below, and maybe we can all help each other out a little. So anyway, I know this video talked a little more about collecting a lot more than simply saving money, but kind of like the first video, I kind of felt like it was a subject. It was also one of the reasons I didn't really get a part 2 up, because, researching into the subject, the market online on eBay, I know eBay been going down the shitter for ages, but Game Gavel went down the shitter with it, and Amazon's been declining when it comes to a lot of subjectable games, and then really the marketplace online's changed a lot, and I had to kind of think about it a bit more, and yeah, that's kind of why it was a bigger subject I feel in this time. So, a few little tips, some stuff that mainly was about collecting, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll stop blabbing so you can get on in the world of video gaming. Until next time.